My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade.
Advocates for the devil's party must at all costs prevent any honest argument from coming to grips with them. For this reason, all their arguments merely evade or abort rather than win the argument. The enemy tactic studied by all their chess masters is how to kick over the chessboard rather than play and win the game. One such useful tactic to silence debate for the devil's party is merely to claim that the future is inevitable, but has been revealed, usually by science, but always by some preposterous claim of titanic intellectual supremacy, open only to them. The matter is as fixed and sure as the time of the next total eclipse of the sun, and equally as immune and indifferent to human tears, needs, or pleas as the motions of the heavenly bodies. In order to promote the idea that history has a fixed plan, which human free will cannot alter, it is useful to pretend that some secret elite of smart people, such as the psychohistorians from Isaac Asimov or the Arisians of Daki E. Smith, have read the stars and know the future, and that the speaker is indeed a member of this elite or enjoys privileged communication with them. Hence it is useful for those in the devil's party to pretend to have read books or pretend to have intellect needed to be an intellectual. This is usually done by mocking all opposition as being ignoramuses, rather than engaging in any sort of debate. Sadly enough, this tactic is all too often adopted by pretend scholars of rather modest ability, who have read at best a few modern restatements of ancient ideas from materialists like Lucretius or Epicurus, or Gnostics like Valentinus or Balsaides, long ago explored and exploded. Such pretend scholars rarely read deeply, hence rarely know about the rebuttals and counter-rebuttals which men of solid education greet as familiar landmarks in the intellectual landscape reaching back centuries or millennia. While it by no means true that this happens in all cases, it happens frequently enough to merit mention. When the advocate for the devil's party meets opponents whose deeper and finer education he cannot match, he has no choice but to spread the peacock plumes of his own vainglory and sneer with all his force. These sneers, the unsupported puffery of his own expertise, are the sole argument he can bring. It is not so much argumentum ad verecundium as argumentum ad ego. Marx used this particular tactic to great effect by pretending his visions of an apocalyptic world revolution to be followed by the New Jerusalem of the workers' paradise, where all scarcity of goods and endless utility of labor were abolished, and all tears wiped away, were not prophetic visions at all, but were some sort of scientific conclusion. In fact, his only innovation as a writer was to elevate the old logical fallacy of argumentum ad hominem to an art form. Because he could defend none of his conclusions, Marx conveniently ruled that all criticism and questioning of his conclusions to be out of bounds, on the grounds that all theories but his were penned by members of the bourgeoisie, who had been hypnotically conditioned by their material surroundings to be loyal to a given means of production. His prediction was that the efficiency of monopolies would require all banks and businesses to combine eventually into one worldwide trust, controlled by an ever-shrinking oligarchy, and that the so-called iron law of wages would eventually drive all wages down to the minimum needed barely to keep the workers alive and healthy enough to perform their labors. Both these woeful predictions had been exploded as absurd by economists long before Marx, a visionary pretending to be an economist, ever took pen to paper. More to the point, both these woeful predictions, and all alike unto them, fail due to their simplicity. Such predictions point at one factor and deduce what might happen if this goes on. That is, if the one factor operates in such a fixed and unchanging fashion and no contrary factors ever come into play. In this particular case, the failure of Marx to take into account the presence of countervailing factors betrays the fundamentally unserious nature of his analysis. In some circumstances, economies of scale give advantage to larger competitors, but in others, the advantage is with the smaller and more agile businesses. Likewise, wage weights are a product of supply and demand, not of any so-called iron law of the minimum needed to keep a worker fed. Any increase in the efficiency of organization or mechanization allows one worker to be productive as many, with a corresponding incentive to raise his wage lest a competitor offer him more. For an economist not to take into account the fact that businesses and wage earners are in competition with each other, each seeking to outbid and underprice the other, is as absurd as an astronomer calculating planetary motions while ignoring gravity. It is relatively easy to predict that the solar system will fly apart once we ignore the force that holds it together. There was a skit on a late-night TV show a while back where the host was pretending to be a carnival barker at the world's worst carnival. One of the attractions was the amazing growing boy. The carnival barker brought out a perfectly ordinary boy and held him in front of a chart showing his growth rate. At 2 years old, he was 1 foot tall. At 6 years old, he was 3 feet tall. Then with a roar of astonishment, the carnival barker shouted, "And, ladies and gentlemen, if this rate of growth continues unchecked, by the time he reaches 20 years old, the amazing growing boy will be 10 feet tall. By the time he is 80 years old, he will be taller than a 40-story building." The economic theory of Karl Marx is no more serious than a late-night comedian joke. The joke is that so many intellectuals for so long took such writing seriously, and some, untutored by the history of the 20th century, apparently still do so. If the examples of the Soviet Union, Red China, Cuba, and Cambodia make no impression on the devout socialist, why would not the example of Venezuela? However, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union did indeed mute the enthusiasm of many socialists in the West. Various theories written by writers like Gramsci, which we may generally group under the heading of cultural Marxism, came to the fore, including the theories of postmodernism, deconstruction, and intersectionalism. The basic idea of cultural Marxism is that the culture, the arts, the news, the schools, and the habits and courtesies of the people is to be taken as the source of the oppression of the downtrodden, rather than taking the political and economic institutions as the source. Now, obviously, since none of these things left to themselves can or would oppress anyone, the crucial part of cultural Marxism is to see invisible signs of oppression and hear inaudible noises and touch the intangible. Cultural Marxism is basically a mystical witch doctor belief system where nearly anything, from a pronoun in the English language to a banana peel thrown into a tree, can suddenly, without warning, turn into a threat of oppression and dignity, real and terrifying, for those with special magical eyeballs needed to see it, as a brigade of heavily armed Waffen-SS. Hence, the entirety of cultural Marxism is based on something like the Hans Christian Andersen fable of the Emperor's New Clothes, where one wicked tailor will scream and claim that some innocent thing is actually a sign of hidden thought crimes, racism, or some such. And the crowd of sycophants compete to see who can shriek agreement most forcefully, lest he too be accused of thought crime. The example of the banana peel is true, by the way. An off-campus fraternity retreat of the University of Mississippi students was cut short because the banana peel made some students feel unsafe, and some wept tears. Gramsci wrote in favor of a slow, passive revolution rather than an immediate, violent overthrow. This was to be accomplished by mandatory education, by subversion of the language, and by silencing the Roman Catholic Church. Control of the media, of the news, is the essential precondition for passive revolution, because then the changes to the mass psychology of the culture can be made to seem organic. The frog does not feel the water boil if the heat is applied gradually enough. The gradual improvement of all minorities in America, at least in areas not under the control of the Democrat politicians, makes the claim of invisible institutionalized racism difficult for all but the most willfully gullible to swallow. A variant on cultural Marxism never foreseen by Gramsci and his fellows include deconstructionism and intersectionalism. Deconstructionism is the theory that one can perceive sinister ulterior motives in any work of art merely by hoodoo and jabberwocky, and anyone who asks you to share your work you can silence by screaming like a banshee, frothing like a mad dog, and calling him names. This gives the advocate of the devil's party even more latitude to make up and ascribe to others whatever sinister motives he needs. In effect, it means that doubt is not possible. Honest dissent is not possible. An open-minded man waiting to be convinced is not possible. The only two possibilities are 1, total and unqualified agreement with whatever the fashionable, politically correct opinion happens to be today, or 2, you are a hater. Intersectionalism is the assertion that the race hatreds that allegedly divide all races of man also somehow divide groups that are not races. They divide men from women, normal from deviant, Christian from heathen, and sane from those suffering sexual dysphoria. By this theory, if a straight black man slaps a lesbian Korean, somehow the white male heterosexual Christian is always to blame for the violence, hence is always the common enemy. And, once again, if anyone asks by what means the utterly imaginary, pale, white man patriarchy arranged for this, you can silence him by screaming like a banshee, frothing like a mad dog, and calling him names. It is not dignified, but few indeed are the men with day jobs who will squander their time to stand and debate a monkey flinging excrement, so the tactic is effective in silencing dissent. Nonetheless, whether in Gramsci or in his deconstructionist or intersectional epigenies, the insurrection and revolution is seen as inevitable. In America, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Women's March protesting the election of Donald Trump, the rise of Black Lives Matter, and the importation of Antifa are meant to be precursors to the violent general uprising among the farmhands and factory hands, which forms the central leitmotif of all Marxist daydreams. Now, since the position of modern farmhands is rather different from the position of the rural peasants in Victorian era, when these theories were first written, one would suppose that the belief in a general uprising would fail in the face of mounting evidence that the proletarian class farm workers have evolved into middle-class farmers with tractors and baling machines who live in houses with electric lights and running water. But the facts present in the material world do not deter prophets and visionaries whose dreams come from the chthonic gods below the caves of Delphi. In the case of cultural Marxism, instead of a general uprising of the lower classes against the upper, what is predicted in America is a race war of blacks against whites, presumably with Caucasians of Spanish and Portuguese ancestry siding with the blacks on the grounds that Hispanics are not Teutonic. Whatever. Cultural Marxism uses the same collectivist and Darwinian analysis as economic Marxism to assert that the collective groups in America of Slavic, Celtic, or African pedigree exist only as eternal victims, being eternally oppressed by a collective group of Anglo-Saxons. In the same way that Marxism blithely ignores the incentives which urge the economic classes to cooperate, cultural Marxism blithely ignores the incentives urging the races to cooperate. The most telling of these incentives is that the race riots destroy the neighborhoods in which the races doing the rioting live. Burning down one's own house and driving small businesses away is not a strategy with long-term positive consequences. The other factor overlooked in both Marxism and cultural Marxism is the simple falsehood of the collectivist model. A factory hand in a car factory in Detroit has a clear common economic interest with his employers, since a loss to them is a loss to him. But, according to Marxism, he allegedly has a unity of interests with a factory hand in a Honda plant in Japan, even though no possible benefit to the one helps the other. Likewise, in cultural Marxism, Barack Obama is classified as a person of color, and thus is said to have a unity of interest with the inner-city blacks, whose misery he exploits for votes, but not to have a unity of interest with, for example, the Caucasian owners and investors of Wall Street banks, who are his employers. As if a black man running a plantation in the antebellum South, or a slave trader from the African coast, had interests in common with the black slaves he sold or worked, but not with his customers and partners. Identity politics is cultural Marxism, pure and simple. It is the idea that a unity of interest exists whenever a crackpot political prophet says you and another man have some surface features in common, and that the real and organic bonds of loyalty, patriotism, economic partnership, and even family love must all fall away in the face of this magical surface feature. This entails the idea in America that race war is inevitable, and therefore one must help bring it about. Of late, some pundits and agitator allegedly on the far right, where for some reason no one but those who believe left-wing collectivist ideologies lodge, have joined in the choir of Gramsci-style predictions and called the race war inevitable. They warn you that your skin color is your uniform, and even if you are not interested in racial identity politics is interested in you. In both cases, the irony of having non-whites support the White Lives Matter style movement and having Black Lives Matter terrorists killing black police officers causes the advocates of this position no pause, no scruple, no hesitation. Likewise, the illogic of urging anyone to support and advance a cause that is said to be inevitable. When is the last time someone asked you to support the next total eclipse of the sun? In all cases, the pretense of inevitability is merely used to silence dissent. There is no point in discussing how to avoid the unavoidable. Race relations in America are better than they have been in generations, and yet the press, hoping to spark a race riot, reports and magnifies each and every smallest conflict. A banana peel in a tree is taken to be a sign that the BLM and the KKK will be fighting pitched battles in the blood-stroked streets tomorrow. The fact that a black man can hold any office in public or private sector, including the president, is not mentioned. The race war is inevitable. The only inevitable theory of history, I believe, is the theory that whenever you hear some intellectual predicting such and such an event must happen because it is a historical inevitability, that such a prediction will be inevitably proved wrong. Both the 1,000-year Reich, predicted of Nazi Germany, and the workers' paradise, predicted of Soviet Russia, have yet to eventuate. Me? I am a Christian. I think history is a story told by the great storyteller. He is not to be mocked, and no mortal can foresee his plot twists, even when he has prophets deliberately do a bit of foreshadowing or scenes from the next episode.